Perfect. Well, welcome to the final class in Deep Dive for Shabbat. It's been a great summer. I've been really enjoying this whole series. As I said in the beginning of last time, it's really given me a lot of the inspiration to do my own continuous deep diving and learning all things Shabbat. And it's really been incredible to learn with you all and to spend the time thinking about sources. And really, it has been something that I've spent my weeks thinking about in terms of how to frame things and how to rethink things. And I think the questioning, is all good Jewish learning and conversation, the sort of back and forth. And a lot of the questions have really sat with me throughout the last couple of weeks. So it's been a really great journey. In terms of today's class, I just want to give a brief introduction. And I see, perfect, a couple of people were able to get in out of the wait room. So this is sort of the culmination of this 5-week class, which we really attempted to view Shabbat from every level possible. So if we've sort of been following in terms of what I've been trying to do, is I really try to find as many different intersections in terms of the celebration of Shabbat as possible. And we really touched on theological aspects of Shabbat, philosophic aspects of Shabbat, communal and sociological aspects of Shabbat, social in terms of social justice and economic aspects of Shabbat, and also individual aspects of Shabbat. So today I want to sort of try to tie them all in together with just some conclusory thoughts about the importance of Shabbat writ large and what it's sort of done for the Jewish tradition. Because as I've sort of hoped to delineate over the past couple of weeks, and I hope it sort of came across, Shabbat in the Jewish mind isn't just another ritual or another section of our tradition or anything like that. Shabbat really is the cornerstone that holds together Jewish community, Jewish values, and Jewish tradition. And really any Jewish community, be it Temple Beth Tikva, be it Hillel, be it any Jewish community for the past 2,000 years, Shabbat is the focal point. Shabbat is where we spend the most amount of time thinking about, the most amount of, if we think about this in terms of resources, right, the most amount of resources, really Shabbat is the thing that holds together a Jewish community. And I hope that now it's become increasingly clear as to why, once we actually start diving into just all the intersections of Shabbat. And so I want to share my screen and share a couple of last sources that I think will just do a really nice job of tying all this together. So in one of, I think, a very amusing and also one of my favorite Talmudic cases, we have a situation where somebody is lost in the desert. And the Talmud is not just concerned with how they end up freeing themselves from the desert. The Talmud ends up being very concerned that if somebody's lost in the desert by themselves, they may cease to have a Shabbat practice. So this is one of my favorite cases in the Talmud because it's such a funny conversation. If you imagine what's actually at stake if somebody's at a point in their life where they have no access to civilization. And so the rabbis are sitting around, again, we can paint this picture, right? The rabbi sitting around talking about Shabbat. And Rav Huna opens up and says, if somebody's traveling on a journey or somebody's lost in the desert and he doesn't know when Shabbat occurs, what happens? So Rav Huna says he counts 6 days from the day that he realized that he lost track of Shabbat, and then he observes a day of Shabbat, right? So again, almost a purposely humorous situation because as we've discussed before, the rabbis of the Talmud definitely appreciate humor, and they also definitely appreciate hyperbolic cases to prove a point, right? I can promise you if anybody's actually lost in the desert, and so much so that they have no access to any civilization, they probably have more to worry about than if Shabbat's in 6 days or not. But again, we paint the picture, somebody who's lost, Rav Huna says, counts 6 days, and then celebrates that 7th day of Shabbat. Chia Bar Rav says, no, he actually observes that day as Shabbat, or that night as Shabbat, and then he counts 6 weekdays and then has another Shabbat. So, okay, to go over painting the general picture, we have a general question, right, problem. Somebody is outside of any civilization, right, outside of any communal framework, right? They have no idea when Shabbat is, right? What do? Well, they count 6 days. According to one opinion, the other opinion says they observe a day of Shabbat and then they stop. So the Gemara says, well, with what do they disagree, right? So the Gemara is trying to figure out why do we have this difference of opinion, right? Why does one side think that you immediately celebrate Shabbat first? Sorry, why does one group think that you immediately celebrate Shabbat in 6 days, and the other group think you say Shabbat immediately? So Rav Huna says, it's like the creation of the world, right? So what happened in the creation of the world, right? You had 6 weekdays and then a 7th Shabbat. So according to one opinion, if you are lost, right? And you can imagine the metaphor here, right? If one is lost, one has no connection with any community, one sort of free floating in space, right? On a journey, right? Whether this be a literal journey or a metaphoric journey, what do? So they try to re-emulate creation, right? They try to go through the same process of 6 days of creation and then 7th day is Shabbat. Rav Chia bar Rav says, no, we actually equate this to Adam, the first human, who was created on the 6th day. So he says, no, the situation is actually a lot more similar to creation happening again. And since humans were created on day 6 and Shabbat was on day 7, that's the cycle that you want to do. I want to say one or two things before we move on, because the source gets even funnier. And so the rabbis then, let me pull something up. Okay, so the rabbis are talking here, and I want to think philosophically for a second. The rabbis are talking about the importance of creating boundaries and creating some sort of structure for somebody that's lost their place, right? I don't think the rabbis here, right? There obviously is a way to take this literally. And I think we could read this as a literal conversation in what does someone actually do if they're rushed. But the rabbis were philosophers, but they were also pragmatists, right? They would tell you that if you're lost in the desert, you shouldn't actually stop what you're doing and celebrate Shabbat. But what they're talking about is the need for Shabbat. And for Shabbat to have the status where Shabbat is able to take an individual or a community from a sense of being metaphorically lost in a desert to being able to create structure and to being able to rebuild something. So the Talmud then continues, and this is one of my favorite parts. And I think this actually will go back to something I believe Marilyn said week 1 or 2 in terms of whether or not the practicing of Shabbat or if the keeping of Shabbat has to be a binary or not. Because the Talmud, interestingly enough, is about to tell us that there's nothing about Shabbat that's a binary in terms of keeping Shabbat or not keeping Shabbat. The Talmud understands that there's layers and a multiplicity of practice. So the rabbis, being the pragmatists they are, they say, this person who lost track of Shabbat and treats a random day of the week as Shabbat, what does he do? Well, you're lost in a desert, right? You have nothing. So each day you make enough food to sustain himself, except for that day, which he designated as Shabbat. So we get a new opinion, right? The Talmud wants to delve into this case a little bit. And the Talmud says, right, you actually, every day you're cooking or you're trying to gather food, you're hunting, however you survive in the desert, basically all bets are off. And on the day that it's Shabbat, well, Shabbat, you're not supposed to cook, you're not supposed to hunt, you're not supposed to gather, so please don't. The Gemara then asks a very funny question. The Gemara says, and on that day, let him die. So the Gemara says, well, what are we supposed to do, right? If you're lost in a desert and every single day you need food to survive, you're not just supposed to keep Shabbat and die, right? As we've talked about before, in Judaism, everything holds precedence. Life holds precedence over almost everything, certainly Shabbat. So the Talmud says, rather it means that the day before Shabbat, you make twice the amount of food that he prepared the other days to sustain him for that day and the following day. So, okay, very similar to the story in the Torah where the Jews are gathering the manna. They are supposed to gather double on Friday and ensure that they have enough for Shabbat. But the Talmud's not happy with that. The Gemara asks, perhaps the day before was actually Shabbat, right? So you can imagine the rabbis are still pushing, right? They're not happy with this. They say, well, what happens if you're lost in a desert, you make up your arbitrary week where Shabbat is, then at a certain point, you decide when your Shabbat is. Every day you need to cook food. Well, it's not good enough to say on Friday, you keep 2 days. On Friday, you cook for 2 days, because what if that Friday is actually Shabbat? So in that case, not only did you perform labor on Shabbat, but you also performed labor on Shabbat in preparation for a weekday. So the rabbis are sort of going crazy. They say, this case is so untenable because you basically completely ruined Shabbat, right? According to a hyper-legalistic view of Shabbat, which the rabbis are about to reject, the rabbis are worried that you're going to be thinking Friday is actually Saturday, and you're going to be preparing for Sunday on actual Shabbat. So the Talmud says, rather on each day, you make enough food to sustain yourself for that day, including on the day for Shabbat. So if we're not following the logic, let me just summarize it real quick, because the real kicker is the line that we're about to read. Somebody's lost in a desert. The rabbis are adamant, and Ethan, I'll take your question in a second. The rabbis are adamant that if somebody is lost, if somebody is completely disconnected from civilization, you still need to celebrate Shabbat, because Shabbat practice is still important. The rabbis are disagreeing as to when you celebrate Shabbat, but everybody says one is lost in a desert, even if one has no connection to a community, even if one doesn't know when the calendar is, they need to celebrate Shabbat. A little side note here, because I think it's important, and this gets back to what we talked about week 2. This is also the rabbis kind of winking to us that obviously in the Jewish tradition and Jewish calendar, Shabbat is Friday night to Saturday night. But this is the rabbis also kind of hinting to us that there may actually be a subjective component to even when Shabbat is practiced, because in this case, it's clear the person's not actually going to end up celebrating Shabbat on Saturday. I'm not saying that we should move to Shabbat till Sunday or Monday or anything like that, but it does seem like in this case of a civilization or an individual that's lost the calendar, the rabbis are willing to play around with the exact time and details of Shabbat. The Gemara then, right, I'm just summarizing again, the Talmud then has this problem, because if you're cooking every day for that day, right, the rabbis don't want you to cook for Shabbat, but the rabbis are afraid that you're going to end up cooking on Shabbat for after Shabbat. So then the rabbis say, okay, you're right. Every day you cook your things. So the last question, and I hope by now everyone's been following, the Gemara is left with a situation where you have your Shabbat celebration, but you're treating Shabbat like every other day. So the rabbis are trying to figure out, well, what's unique about that 7th day that you're actually celebrating Shabbat? So the rabbis ask this final question: how fast is the day which you designated, how is that day which you designated as Shabbat distinguishable from the rest? The Talmud says it is distinguishable by means of Kiddush and Havdalah that he recites on that day. So the rabbis say, if nothing else, Shabbat is a time that needs to be bookmarked. Fine, we're not going to have any Shabbat malachot, right? The 39 prohibitions of work obviously do not apply to this. But the rabbis, at the very least, want to make sure that you're bookmarking Shabbat, because they're afraid that you're going to be in a situation where you've just completely lost track of the calendar. And so, if nothing else, bookmark Shabbat before and after, so you actually have an idea of when this one day of a week is. The reason why I wanted to bring this is twofold. One, because I think the power of Shabbat in terms of being a day that's so important that the rabbis even wanted a Shabbat practice in a time and in a situation where somebody's completely lost, somebody's disconnected from society. I think that's a crucial point. The second point I think is equally important, and it goes back to something we've been talking about all week, which is Shabbat is not an all or nothing thing. And if there's one sort of meta idea that I really hope to get across, it's that there's infinite ways to celebrate Shabbat. And every incremental step towards being more mindful on Shabbat, being more a part of the community on Shabbat, being more separated from the rest of your week on Shabbat is a positive, even if the only thing somebody's doing to mark Shabbat is these two bookends, right? The Kiddush to start it and Havdalah to end. Just know that the time is different. You can imagine the rabbi saying. Ethan, go for it. You had a question.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised the nature of this conversation turns. And granted, you were saying some of this might be a little bit in jest, like kind of looking at the language a little bit. But I feel like, I mean, for me, when I first thought of it, the obvious answer for me was, oh, well, observe the very next day as Shabbat, because it's better to do more one Shabbat too many than one Shabbat not enough. And so I thought that, for me, that just stood out right away. I was kind of surprised that there was this much, I mean, I'm not surprised because it's Jewish stuff and there's this much conversation about everything. But I was kind of surprised the way this debate went.
Yeah. And it's totally non-intuitive, right? I mean, this I'll take even a step back. This entire discussion is not intuitive, because this is such a ridiculous, I mean, I say this in a good way, right? Like, if, again, like I said this before, if you're lost in the desert, the last thing you're thinking about is ensuring that in 6 days from now, you're celebrating Shabbat, right? And if you're on a journey, right, I don't know how, I mean, maybe it's possible in the ancient world, 1800 years ago, somebody would get on a ship and go on a journey and completely lose track of the calendar, right? But you're right? It is a very interesting situation. And yeah, it is a, you know, the sort of flip side case is also really interesting, right? What happens when that person reconnects with the Jewish community and their Shabbat is on a Wednesday, right? Do they then have to switch back, right? The answer is probably yes, but I think, you know, there's interesting ways to tease that out. But yeah, any other thoughts about this sort of wider case? Let me stop sharing for a second in case people have. I'm curious what people think of this wider conversation about both this idea that Shabbat is important just to ground somebody when they're disconnected from community and civilization, and also the idea that Shabbat is so much not a binary of practicing Shabbat or not practicing, that even just bookending, right, is important.
Thing up there's a place where you put your hand.
Go for it, Jerry.
I'm not sure I speak, but I just can't help but see the humor in asking this question. Because immediately 2 questions jump to my mind. If we send an Israeli astronaut up, are they going to consult with the rabbis about how they're supposed to celebrate Shabbat? And my second question is, anybody who's seen Around the World in 80 Days knows that you can cross the international date line and lose a day somehow. What do you do if you lose the day of Shabbat? I'm sorry, I just couldn't, you know, this is somewhat esoteric, and I just thought that there are permutations that we can get on this question that start to defy somewhat logic.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I actually believe, I might completely butcher this, so please fact check me here after. I believe that what's his name, Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, actually, right, he described himself as a pretty secular Jew, but I actually think he did go and ask rabbis this exact question and end up making either kiddush or some sort of way to mark Shabbat while he was in space. So it's obviously humorous, meaning I don't want to take away from the humor, because again, part of the way, right, one of the unique things about Talmud, just taking a step back, because we really spent a lot of time studying Talmud throughout these last 5 weeks, even if it wasn't, you know, the direct study of Talmud, a lot of our sources and questions and ways of thinking about things has arisen from the Talmud, which is how Judaism's operated over the past 1800 years. The Talmud has it's very strange because it's not a legal book, right? The Talmud's not a book of law, but it's also not a storybook. It's like somebody took both of them, couldn't decide what they wanted to write, and then fused them together. And part of the way you actually cultivate interest, right? Think Passover Seder, right? The same people who wrote the Talmud were the people who designed our Passover Seder and the Passover Haggadah. And there they show their cards on the table, right? They explicitly say the entire point of the Passover Seder is to do a whole bunch of strange things in order to get really children, but the community to ask questions. And so the rabbis very much, again, they had this sort of, okay, we have this idea. How far can we keep pushing this idea? Because they want people to talk about it, because now that we're sitting here kind of smiling and saying, well, this is such a ridiculous case. Well, what else are we going to say about it? And that's where I think they really wanted to have Jewish conversation. So
don't get me wrong. I think asking the question is somewhat humorous, but I can also see where to, if you're certainly Shomer Shabbos, it actually, and you happen to land in one of those situations, it's also a serious question, which gives it both aspects, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. And this has actually been, I mean, there are cases where not this exact case, but again, there have been times throughout Jewish history where things have been crazy enough where cases in the Talmud that one might read in one light of, oh, this is a hyperbolic situation that might never happen, actually turns out to have later Jewish significance. The most interesting case of this is, this is, a tangent, but hopefully an interesting one. The Talmud asks a question of what happens if a cow is pregnant and then magically puts that pregnancy into another cow. Now, I can promise you the rabbis had no conception of all of the medical technology we have in terms of IVF and all of those things. And that case is purely hypothetical because the rabbis are attempting to tease out, what is it that makes something a firstborn? Is it the actual act of giving birth? Is it the act of conception, right? A lot of conversations, albeit in a different way, we actually have now in our society, right? If there are different laws in terms of who is born to who and when a child is viable and all of these things, right? These are important questions for any society to figure out. And so the rabbis are giving all these thought experiments. And that actually becomes the basis, of course, hundreds of years later for a lot of rabbinic responsa in thinking about, well, what happens if I'm a Kohen or what happens if a mother is a Kohen and she does IVF and the birthing mother ends up not being a Kohen, right? Is that child the bat Kohen or not, right? And all of these questions. So yeah, 100%, Jerry. The Jewish literature sort of is in a free fall between this is a very interesting hyperbolic story to, hey, actually we can derive some law and some real conclusion from here. Any other thoughts and questions before we move on a little bit? Perfect. Okay. So I want to slowly start coming in for an overall conclusion and landing here, just in terms of what we're doing. So I want to spend just 2 minutes painting a little picture, fusing everything we've kind of talked about, and then we'll look at some more sources, and we'll try to finish by 7 so people can make their meetings. One of the things in which Judaism has long believed, and I think one of the things at the core of our being, and one of the things that we've really brought to the world, I think now we actually take for granted, because now this is the way that the vast majority of people, at least in the West, think about the world and think about history. But one of the things that I think Judaism really brought out was this idea that time is linear, in a way where the entire fabric of the world, and this is certainly an idea born out in classical Judaism, this is an idea born out in the Kabbalistic literature, right? This is a mainstay of Jewish idea. The world is broken where we are right now, but there's a time in the future where if we act, if we put the pieces back together, we can fix the world, right? That's the basic notion of tikkun olam, right? The reason why Jewish tradition is so focused around action, because we genuinely believe that human action has the power to fix the world, right? It's very much not a worldview that's fatalistic. It's very much not a worldview that tries to belittle human ingenuity and human free will, right? Judaism has a radical idea that we actually have the ability to change the future. And so one of these ideas that Judaism has a long paid attention to, and I don't care necessarily how literal or metaphorical we imagine this, but Judaism has a long envisioned a day in the future, right? Call it the age of the Messiah, call it the Messianic age, call it just when we've gotten our act together and the world is actually perfect, right? However we want to conceptualize of this, Judaism has long believed that sometime in the future, right? Not right now, and that's really important. Another 30-second tangent. There's been a lot of times in Jewish history where people have said that we're in the Messianic age, and it always ends poorly, right? We have Bar Kokhba, we have Shabtai Tzvi, we have a lot of other cases throughout Jewish history, right? It never ends well when somebody claims the Messiah is already here. Because if you believe that the world is already perfect, you're not paying attention, or you're really naive, or you plan to do something really terrible, because any quick fixes, right? If you believe that tomorrow you can make the world perfect, you're probably going to do not so great things to achieve that end. And we've seen that in way too many religions and political movements and things like that. But the idea that sometime in the future, right, the ever future, the world is going to be perfect, is an idea that Jews have constantly looked towards, and it's been constant inspiration. It's something that I think has motivated Jewish communities to move forward at some of the darkest times in our history, You can read writings during the Crusades, during the Holocaust, of Jewish thinkers that are basically saying right now is bad, but we do believe we can rebuild from this. It's motivated Jews, I think, to be at the forefront of social progress, of technological innovation, right? This idea that what we do now can actually affect the world for better. Now, the problem is, oftentimes it seems like that's not true, right? And however we want to imagine this, whether individually, whether societally, whether politically, right? Oftentimes it seems like that very neat, arc bending towards justice, it seems like that's an incorrect view of history, right? And there's certainly been times in Jewish history, there's certainly been a time in world history, maybe there's even been times in our own lives in the last couple of years or months where it seemed that that's true, right? It seems like we're regressing, right? However you want to imagine that regression. And what Shabbat holds, and this is sort of the last aspect of Shabbat that I want to look into, a way that I thought was perfect to summarize this, is that Jewish thinkers have long held up Shabbat as a taste of what the world will look like when it's perfect. And this seems like we're playing some communal psychological mind game. And in a sense, we almost are. Because according to this last perspective of Shabbat, Shabbat is a day in which, again, just to review everything we've discussed, right? A day separated out from the rest of the week, a day in which we cease from attempting to change the world at all, a day in which we're obligated to be there with our community, with our family, with our loved ones, and quite literally feign ignorance about what's going on in the rest of the world, right? It's almost right. Judaism very much does not believe ignorance is bliss, but one day a week, we actually turn on the ignorance very high. Because on Shabbat, you're not supposed to be listening to the news or scrolling Twitter to see what else wrong has happened in the world. And one of the ways in which Jewish thinkers explain this, and we'll go over some sources, but I wanted to just paint the picture and then we'll see if there's any questions before we go into the last couple of sources, is that Shabbat is the constant weekly reminder that this is actually a possibility. So it's not that on Shabbat we're being naive, and on Shabbat we're saying, oh yeah, the world is perfect today, I don't need to do anything. But imagining taking one day a week that's separated, that's actually envisioning a world that has already been perfect, is exactly what we need. We, either as individuals, as a Jewish community, as a society, it's exactly what we need in order to ensure that we continuously work towards that end. Because otherwise it's so easy to just give up. So we'll go see some sources in a second. Any thoughts or questions before? Sorry, I'm just catching up on some of the comments. Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go over the last couple of sources here.
Can I sneak in a question?
Yes, you may. Go for it.
So I thought that was interesting, saying how, okay, like Shabbat, like whenever we reach the age of whatever, Shabbat is what it should be like, or what we envision it'll be like. But that seemed, I don't know, that doesn't seem very peaceful for me. Like, it feels like that would almost be too easy and it wouldn't give humans the opportunity to like exercise what like they and we all can do. Because like for me, for example, if I don't do any work for a day straight, I go crazy. Like I need something to like struggle against. And maybe the answer to that is like, oh, you think that way because you can't possibly envision what that time will be like. Fine. But that was just my reaction thought to that.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, it's not, I don't want to paint the picture like it's easy to have this suspension of belief, because I actually think it's very difficult. I think in general, the idea of rest, I mean, we discussed this the first week, but just to review, right? The first source we looked at is the idea that rest is something that actually has to be created, because it is really hard to actually disconnect and to actually rest, right? Rest is not sitting on your couch and watching TV. Rest is actually some, deep metaphysical resting from all the work that's necessary, all the problems of the world, like really like trying to put on this different, right? The way in which rabbinic literature summarizes it is on Shabbat, you have a neshama yetera, like an additional or extra soul, right? Like you're almost trying to become more than human to some extent. So it is hard. Again, I think that Jewish tradition is being mostly pragmatic here, in that I don't think it's possible to just continuously work without a break. I mean, in sort of all society, I mean, even now, a lot of companies are moving towards even 4-day work weeks, and they're realizing they're being just as productive because in fewer hours, people are able to put in more work and stuff like that. So I totally get the tension, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
No, not really.
Awesome. Yeah, and again, listen, it's totally fine and even recommended to disagree here. You know, again, one of the other things you get from a Talmud study is if Jews agreed with each other all the time, we'd have a lot less literature to then discuss and just talk about. So just a couple final sources just to sort of bring this home a little bit. In Maimonides, the Guide to the Perplexed, right? This is the Rambam's or Maimonides' seminal philosophic work. And one of the things that Maimonides attempted to do, one of his methodological pieces, was that he attempted to explain all aspects of Judaism according to Greek rationalism. And so the Rambam was the opposite of the school of thought that said, you do something because God said so. Maimonides always said, well, there needs to be an actual reason, right? And so he writes this entire book coming up with what he believes to be rational reasons for all the mitzvot. Some of it holds up quite nicely. Some of it doesn't really hold up at all, right? I think now we know you can create some very non-healthy kosher food, right? That's just one of them. But he writes about Shabbat. And what's interesting in his treatment of Shabbat in this philosophic work is he gives it almost no space, which is really interesting because he spends an entire book, and Guide to the Perplexed is huge, if anyone's ever had a chance to look at it. And the Rambam devotes almost zero space to his discussion about Shabbat, because for him, it just seems so obvious how important of a day this is. It's like, well, we don't even need a rational defense of Shabbat, right? Anybody who's paying attention understands. And so he writes, the object of Shabbat is obvious and requires no explanation. So he's like, okay, it's not even worthwhile explaining this. The rest it affords to mankind is known. 1/7 of the life of every person, whether small or great, passes thus in comfort and in rest from trouble and exertion. This the Shabbat affects in addition to the perpetuation and confirmation of the grand doctrine of creation. So he says, yeah, you know, we have this big theological and metaphysical thing, but really, right, the rational defense, the obvious defense of Shabbat is just, it's a 1 day a week to be comfortable. It's 1 day a week to, again, as hard as this is, to actually attempt to get into a mindset that things are already perfect, right? Everything that I needed to take care of, well, it's out of my control now, right? I can't do it. Just remembering growing up, the 45 minutes before Shabbat are always somehow the most hectic time of the week. It didn't make a difference if Shabbat started at 5 p.m. in December or if Shabbat started at 8:30 p.m. in the summer. No matter what, it's always the most hectic time because there's always something that you forgot in terms of setting up lights or in terms of cooking food or something still being in the car, right? And you just imagine this chaos that strikes leading up to Shabbat, right? You're trying to answer that last work email. You're trying to do all these things. The second Shabbat comes, right? The idea is, well, whatever, right? Who cares if the light is off? I'll have to, attempt to read with a lot less light tonight, or I'll have to sleep with the bedroom light on this Shabbat, right? Like, and that's really, I think, the picture that we're trying to paint. But again, the metaphor of that isn't just whether or not a light's going to be on or off for the weekend. It's big picture issues. It's find a time to disconnect from all the trouble in the world, not because we're naively trying to ignore it, but because you need a break in order to then actually continue, for lack of a better terminology, the good fight towards a perfect world come the first day of the week, Yom Rishon, which is Sunday. Just another source along this line, they said about Shammai the elder, right? I really like the source. It doesn't exactly fit in with this theme, but I was trying to figure out which source sheet to put this on, and I think it does work a little nicely with this topic, even though not perfectly, that all of his days he would eat in honor of Shabbat. So here we're seeing that Shabbat is not just supposed to be a day of the week that's separated and off, but Shabbat can actually inspire the other days of the week, right? How so? If he found a choice animal, he would say, this is for Shabbat. So every time he came across something especially nice, save that for Shabbat. If he subsequently found another animal choicier than it, he would set aside the second for Shabbat and eat the first. He would eat the first to leave the better quality animal for Shabbat, which continuously rendered his eating an act of honoring Shabbat. So Shammai basically ate in such a way that every meal that he had during the week, he was always thinking about Shabbat, right? Is this food better than what I'm about to eat Friday night? Because if so, let me just switch them, right? But again, a way to continuously have in your mind this idea that perfection, or even if we don't want to think in terms of these grand terms such as perfection, a world that's better than what it is now is always within a week's reach. And that, I think, is such a crucial motivating factor, right? It's so important for an individual, for a community, really for a world, that you can see how quickly positivity seems to spiral without having a time to step back and disconnect for it and actually take a break. We'll do one or two more sources and then we'll have a little conversation. We'll wrap it up, right? This is another fascinating source, and this gets right into the idea that Shabbat is a taste of the Messianic age. So the Talmud famously tells us that there are 5 things in the world that are a 60th of something else. So what is it? Fire, honey, Shabbat, sleep, and dreams. They say fire is 1/60th a part of Gehenna. We'll leave that comment for a future class in terms of what do Jews actually think about hell, right? That's a much longer conversation, but the rabbis seem to think fire is 1/60th of Gehenna, which is usually somewhat incorrectly, but somewhat correctly translated to be hell. But again, for a later time, honey is 1/60th a part of the manna that fell from heaven in the desert. Shabbat is 1/60th a part of the world to come. Sleep is 1/60th of death. This is actually why a lot of people, just a quick tangent, have a custom when they wake up in the morning to wash their hands, because they're washing away the tumah, the impurity of the 1/60th of death. And also another reason why a lot of people have the custom of saying Modeh Ani in the morning, because Modeh Ani, you're thanking God for restoring a soul. And then a dream is 1/60th a part of prophecy, right? So the rabbis are coming up with these things that they say are like a taste of something else. And what they say is Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. So what does that mean? So the Midrash continues, right? This is a later Midrash, which says when the Jewish people were gathered at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, God told them that the world to come would be their reward for keeping the commandments, right? The Jews asked God, well, how do you know that this world is so great, right? You can just imagine, I just love the chutzpah here, inherent in the source of God saying, right, whether or not we theologically believe that the world to come is a reward for keeping commandments, just in terms of appreciating the chutzpah of this source, right? God is saying, well, here's your grand reward going to be. And how do we know that's going to be so great? And so God didn't get upset. If God got upset, the Jewish people would have had problems with God a long time ago, right? God says, no problem, I'll send you a sample. Shabbat. Thus the sages say, Shabbat is a taste of heaven on earth. If heaven is pure spirituality, Shabbat is a taste of that experience. We have 2 more sources that I want to get through, and then I'll conclude up, and then we'll have some thoughts here. But again, the overall sense of these sources that we're getting is this movement by the rabbis to ensure that Shabbat is seen as more than the sum of its parts, right? We can talk about all these different aspects of what Shabbat is, all of the important reasons for Shabbat in terms of personal, communal, philosophic, economic, theological. But Shabbat is supposed to converge, and something that's greater than any given part of Shabbat is supposed to come up from it. And again, this is a hard practice, right? I don't want to lower the threshold for how difficult this is to obtain. And I really do think Shabbat is like any other consistent practice that somebody signs up for, which is it's always very hard when you're on the outside of it. I think a couple of weeks ago, I gave the analogy to somebody who had never seen a gym before and walks by the windows of a 24-hour fitness and sees some people on treadmills and other people lifting weights. And if you can imagine this alien that's never seen a gym before would probably think this is a torture station. because you have people that are on ramps that are moving and they have to keep moving and they don't look happy, and other people that are trying to lift very heavy things off of them, right? But again, people that have a consistent workout practice or anything like that, right? What emerges from that is greater than any one moment in there, because the exact moments added up of the experience of working out or doing something that's difficult or anything that challenges us in a good way, second to second, it seems like somebody's miserable, but yet when we look back, I'm always happy that I worked out last Tuesday. Even though any minute you asked me last Tuesday if I was happy with what I was doing, I would probably say no if I was mid set of, push-ups or pull-ups. And really Shabbat is the same way, where at any given minute, it's not convenient to be celebrating Shabbat, right? Like there's always something else one could be doing, right? There's always some other interesting media thing out there, right? There's always an interesting event going on, right? During weekends, there's always more work to do, right? But yet what emerges in terms of an individual, in terms of a community, in terms of a real outlook on life, is something that actually attempts to mirror perfection. This is one of my favorite songs. There's a famous Zamir, or song that some people have a tradition of singing Friday night, called My Yedidut. And it was written by a poet named Menachem ibn Saruk in the 10th century sometime. And the last paragraph, it sort of, goes through different aspects of Shabbat. And this is sort of a love poem towards Shabbat. And then at the end, the tune changes and it says, a reflection of the world to come, restful Shabbat day. All who delight in it will merit much gladness. Much is spelled wrong here. From the birth pangs of the Messiah, they will be rescued in relief. May our redemption flourish so that grief and sorrow may flee. Let's rejoice in delicacies. And just again, this picture that if I had to guess, because this isn't that hard of a thing to guess, this was written in a time and place where Jewish life was not simple. And there were a lot of things to be sorrow about and to feel grief about. But yet this vision, this idea that once a week, right, we can imagine the Achad Ha'am quote, right? The more than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. Because really this idea of being able to come together and having respite from everything else that's happening in the world is such a crucial thing in order to be a motivating factor to keep going. So just the last source that I want to do, and I think I mentioned this book before, and then we can have a conversation for a couple minutes, is Judith Sholovitz's The Sabbath World, which is an excellent book. I actually got it after seeing a quote from her after the first class. And so I got it and just finished reading it over the past 5 weeks. So this is, part of my fun research for this class. And this is really interesting. It's a really interesting book. Just to give a tangent and a plug for a second. She did not grow up or is currently a very traditional Jew. She's somebody that basically came upon Shabbat later in life and started taking on some of the practices, right? Still in the book, she describes, she actually wrote this 20 years ago, so I don't know what's happening now, but at least as of the time of writing, she said, well, she's not observant in the traditional way, but the whole thing is about why Shabbat is so important, right? What she's discovered after keeping more and more of the Shabbat practices. And so she writes here, which I really like this quote, the rabbis say that Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. Me, I think it's an aftertaste of infancy. It's a fantasy of perfect wholeness. If adult life is divided, the Sabbath is when we become one with our family, with our community, and with God. And so just as I thought that was a great quote just to sort of conclude all of the source learning. Again, we can have some time for questions and discussion. We still have 12 minutes on the clock here. But this idea that Shabbat, we're attempting to take our attention and our lives and our community, which during the week are necessarily going to be fragmented between everything that's going on, and attempt to, at least for one day a week, come together and go back to some picture of wholeness, back to some picture of just utter simplicity, right? Where our worries are not what's going on in the wider world, what's going on in the community, what's going on in our bank account, right? All of these things that the rest of the week are very important things to worry about. Shabbat is a day in which you just are. And so this idea that Shabbat is a taste or is a reminder or an illusion, if you want to be a little bit more skeptical of what happens when the world is perfect, I think is just the perfect way to conclude our discussion about Shabbat, because not only is this a great way of, I think, summarizing what something means to be greater than its composite parts, right? And Shabbat is certainly a part of the Jewish calendar that is more than any one part of Shabbat. But I think also it shows Judaism's approach to the world in general, which is we are a tradition of people who believe in action, who want to go out and fix the world, who do believe in this idea, however we want to frame it, of the fact that we can make the world a better place, that we do believe in this idea of tikkun olam, right? Not just as a fancy social justice catchphrase, but really as a deep philosophic idea that what we do can fix the world, which is radically different than a lot of other philosophies that one can find out there in the world that says, well, humans don't really have any power to act and you have to listen to your leaders and whatever. No, every single person, Judaism believes, has the power, and not just the power, right? In Judaism, when you have power, that also comes with a moral imperative. So you have the moral imperative to make sure that the world is getting increasingly fixed. Shabbat is the perfect way to structure that. Susan, go for it.
What struck me, and this is a quick thought, so that when she says it's an aftertaste of infancy, as an infant, the world revolves around us, the individual. But then at the end of the quote, you've got the oneness with family and community, and an infant needs the villagers to help it grow. And so I think that the idea of an aftertaste of infancy, because actually when one rests on Shabbat or when one observes Shabbat, it does something for the individual. It's the individual who can get more strength and to go on and do whatever in the week to come. So I like that analogy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been thinking about that analogy a lot. And also, I think, funny enough, I think, when you're an infant, you're also, yeah, sure, you're oblivious to what's going on in the world, but you're also quite powerless to change what's going on in the world, which I think is also a component for Shabbat, right? Like it's a day of the week in which you acknowledge that, right? Kind of what we talked about this a little bit last week, right? It's also a day of humility, right? The other 6 days a week, right? You can go out and fix the world. One day a week, we say, okay, but don't get too haughty and think that you're the only one that can fix the world, right? You can take a break for a day and things will function just fine, right? And constantly having this balance, which again, I think Judaism is all about balance of philosophic extremes, right? We don't want people to think they are the most powerful people who can fix the world and it's only relying on them. We also don't want people to say, well, I'm nothing and nothing I do makes a difference. So we very much try to fuse those two. And 6 days a week, we do say, yes, you can go out and fix the world and it's all, up to you humans. And then one day a week, we say, okay, you know what? If we don't do anything today, it's not like the world will collapse after 25 hours. So I love that, Susan. Any other overall thoughts, questions, reflections, could be not just on today, but over the past 5 weeks in general?
So one question that I had that came up. So I know Guide to the Perplexed was like a very controversial thing at the time that got Maimonides in trouble. But that specific text that we read, arguing like the faith and reason kind of argument and the reasoning behind Shabbat, and there is this reason behind Shabbat. Was that part of the controversialness of it back like in the 1300s?
Yeah, it's a great question. Short answer is no. The short answer is the true controversy in the Rambam was in terms of the methodology of what he was trying to do. So this didn't happen to be such a controversial. I mean, everybody, rest is not a controversial issue. The real controversy of Maimonides was his attempt to bring in what was seen at the time to be an outside school of thought, right? Rationalism in Greek philosophy, and merge it with Judaism in a way that, sometimes works better than others, right? And so that was seen as really the controversy of his book, rather than say, and this is also why Maimonides is the most important Jewish philosopher, in the Middle Ages, but probably throughout history, because before Maimonides, there was a lot more of a hesitation from the Jewish community to accept outside schools of thought, such as Greek philosophy, right? There was a big, this isn't exactly true, but this is the stereotypical and generalized thing that people say about Maimonides. There were thinkers before Maimonides, Sadjagon and the like, but he was the first one to really say, we can take this school of thought that is rooted outside Judaism, and we take Judaism and just merge them. And so if Aristotle teaches that the universe has always been here and there was no creation, well, we can interpret Genesis in a way where you actually don't need creation, which is something he did, right? So Maimonides he revolutionized Judaism by opening the door to a philosophic interpretation of the Torah that is very much not literal, but to allow Judaism to be able to merge with other wisdom traditions. It's also why, just as another tangent, it's also why I think Judaism was able to not just survive, but really thrive after the Enlightenment in terms of new schools of Jewish thought and new Jewish thinkers. I mean, the last 200 years in the Jewish community, right? Not just talking about, Reform and conservative and Reconstructionism, although those are certainly under the umbrella, but the number of interesting new schools of thought in Jewish philosophy that have popped up in the last 150 years is incredible, right? It's not that the Jewish community, met the theory of evolution and met Wellhausen and the academic study of religion and said, well, no, we don't want anything to do with this. Most of the Jewish community said, okay, well, let's see what we can work with, right? We have this longstanding tradition of being able to reconcile Judaism with outside schools of thought, right? Let's keep doing that, right? At the time, and still today, not everybody liked that approach. So that's why. I assume his Shabbat comments would probably be more universally accepted.
So that time period is so interesting for that faith and reason argument, because it wasn't just like Maimonides and Judaism making that argument, but like Thomas Aquinas and Christianity and like Ibn Rushd in Islam. It's just such an interesting phenomenon that at that time, faith and reason was becoming so like prevalent.
Yeah, 100%. Any last minute thoughts? We have 4 or 5 minutes left.
I have to say, I would read the comment from the Rambam very carefully, because he talked about the benefits of rest and all that. If you read the last sentence, he really gets to the heart of the matter, which is that the reason for the Sabbath is because the time is sacred. If you read that last sentence, that it brings back to the creation, and that we honor the Sabbath because the time is a sacred time, and we don't do it for its benefit. I mean, there are benefits to rest, but I read the entirety of the comment to say that that's one of the reasons you may want to do it. But the final reason is in the last sentence, where he talks about honoring the creation. And I just, I wouldn't go too far into putting, Spinoza into Maimonides. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, no, very, very well taken. It's funny you said that, so I have to give one tangent joke. I'm forgetting where I heard the story, but there's the study of Maimonides has become very controversial because Maimonides wrote a lot of different books and had a lot of different philosophies, and so there's different schools of thought where some people try to say, well, Maimonides is basically Spinoza. Others want to say, no, Maimonides is, very traditional and all these things. So there was a conference, this is probably in like the 70s or 80s, full of different scholars on Maimonides that all thought Maimonides believed something completely different. And so one scholar went up and approached and, gave their speech, and then the second scholar was about to disagree. And so he started off the speech by, well, that was a really nice presentation. You can have your Maimonides, but I'll take my Maimonides. And here's what he really believed. And so it was great. But I also loved your comment, because I think that's a perfect circle, because I think that was the first thing you said after the very first source in class, which was that Shabbat really does start with an acknowledgement of creation and acknowledgement of sacred time, which, again, perfect way to start and end. right? This idea that Shabbat is the affirmation, most fundamentally, that there is more to life than physicality, and that we do believe in metaphysical values, ideas, and structure in the world. And what better proof of this, and by proof, I don't mean empirical proof, but what better practice proof than this, by actually observing sacred times, by actually saying not all time is equal, and that there are times that are separated, right? The word kodesh in Hebrew just means separated. There are times that are separated out for unique circumstances. So thank you so much, Jerry. It's 7 o'clock now, so I think I'm going to conclude. This was really, really wonderful. So thank you all for, hanging out with me this summer and being, again, the inspiration for thoughts and conversations and all of this. Hope to see you all very soon. I'll hang out on Zoom for a couple of minutes. But yeah, this is really wonderful. And let's keep on learning. Again, just because a class on a specific topic ends doesn't mean the conversation on it ends, and doesn't mean the experimentation for how to implement some of these things, whether in our own life or in our community, ends. So let's really be thought partners over the course of the year to try to figure out how to take some of these ideas from paper into practice. So have a great evening, everybody, and I'll say Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Before I head off, I just want to say thank you, Daniel. I very much appreciated this